Hello everyone, welcome to the Thought Leadership series with CMOs. And in this series we interview marketing leaders, executives to help you grow as a marketer and CMOs. My name is Jerry Zhao and I'm the founder and CEO of Retention Science. Today we have a special guest, Greg Bettinelli, who was the founding and the first CMO of HauteLook, which is now part of Nordstrom. And we're excited to have him to share with you what's it like to build and scale one of the hottest flat sales site. And throughout the presentation today, feel free to tweet at us with any questions you might have, as well as type it in your webinar box and submit your questions, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. And so with no further ado, I want to introduce Greg. Greg, prior to becoming the CMO of HauteLook, he was an executive VP at Live Nation, as well as spending time as a GM managing different groups under eBay, and primarily also in charge of the acquisition of StubHub. And he's had a long journey becoming a CMO. And Greg, welcome to the webinar today.
Thank you.
And I think there are about 200 of us that are here, and then wanted to really just learn about you as a CMO, your journey becoming a CMO. So one of the first questions is, what's it like being the CMO of HauteLook and going through the transaction of becoming part of Nordstrom?
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. For those of you who can't see, there's all sorts of cool technology, and I'm busy tweeting questions to myself because that's what Jerry told me to do. But I'm glad I could be here, and the dozens and hundreds of people at home who obviously had a lot going on to spend time with us today. But being a CMO, or especially related to HauteLook, it was kind of laughable that I would have actually had a job like that 5 years ago. As you mentioned, I grew up at eBay, as I like to say. Spent a lot of time on business development, partnerships, public relations, things like that, but happened to work with a lot of very strong marketers. And in 2009, if you remember, the economy wasn't in the greatest shape. You're a young kid, but in 2009 it wasn't what it is today. And here in Los Angeles, we're based and where we are today, there was a fledgling e-commerce business called HauteLook that no one actually said that way. People said HauteLook or HauteLook or whatever they wanted to call it at the time. And there weren't a lot of people in Los Angeles who knew anything about e-commerce. And I had, like I said, had moved down to Los Angeles after spending 5 years at eBay and sort of pretended that I knew what I was talking about in regards to marketing. I had grown up in and around analytics, and so I was a marketing analyst straight out of college, actually for a racetrack, which has nothing to do with anything we're talking about. But I grew up on the analytics side of the marketing world. And then through my experiences when eBay and others got the idea of what brand means, what e-commerce is, and candidly packaged them and put them together for the opportunity at HauteLook. And I think today is even more so than 5 years ago. There are no true unicorn CMOs. I think everyone looks for someone who understands brand, the soft side of a business, but also understands the analytics and customer acquisition and retention. The reality is very few people have done that. And so I actually came at it from the analytics side and the branding side and learned the customer acquisition and retention side over time.
Yeah, so you brought a really interesting point, the concept of unicorn CMO, and there are many of us that are either listening or watching this webinar. I think many of them are aspiring to become a CMO. They might be director of marketing, email marketing managers, and many of them are kind of curious about what exactly is a day in your life like. Are you out there speaking at conferences, or are you looking at analytics reports constantly, giving your analytics background, or are you really thinking about the big picture, like the branding aspect of the business, or how much attention do you pay into like the day-to-day office?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it all has to do with the stage of the company, right? So if I look back at HauteLook as an example, in the spring of 2009, we're a business that we're just doing $2 million a month in sales, which seems like a lot now. It seemed like a lot then. Relatively speaking, it wasn't very much. And I was as you mentioned, I was the first marketing person. So I had primarily had to figure out exactly what we were doing, really keep score. The first thing we did the first day was build a scorecard. Okay. Like that was, you got to know where you are each and every day. And then from there, it's finding the biggest gaps and hiring the team to fill those gaps and finding the technology to help do that. So in 2009, if I look back, my first week was about figuring out how to send out 2 million emails a day and not get them in the junk folder.
Sure.
Right? And we were, if I remember correctly, we were using Cheetah Mail, which is owned by, I don't know if they're owned by Experian then or not. And we had literally, the way emails were sent was first in, first out.
Right.
So if you were sign up number 1, your email went out at 7:57 in the morning. If you were sign up number 1 million, your email went out the 1 millionth email. So there was no prioritization, no selection based on who got the emails what, based upon open rates or transaction volumes or VIP status, et cetera.
Right.
So it was literally just the Wild West from that perspective. And we were very early in the first ones really, us and a couple other companies sending out those type of volumes that fast from an email perspective. So I remember at that point, it was literally just trying to keep the business on the inside the, using a bowling alley analogy, just keep the ball out of the gutter.
Sure.
Right? And then from there it was like, okay, let's figure out things like customer acquisition. So back then it was search and display. How do you look at things from a CPM basis versus a CPA basis? It was thinking about things like attribution. What we had done early, and we were very good about tracking each individual customer acquisition program to figure out what the cohorts were doing. So at the earliest level, having the data and the transactions were happening, we were lucky in that the demand for the business was real, and we didn't have to build that organically. It was happening organically,
Right.
which isn't as easy to do. It's much harder to do it the real way, but we were very lucky as a business. And so trying to figure out exactly how to know which customer groups were doing what, so we could start valuing customers over time.
Right.
Not even thinking about retention, just thinking
Right.
about if I can get them in the funnel, what happens to them over time. And so investing in that infrastructure, which will change as you scale, but it was important to do very early as well. And then as we grew, there was always new challenges. So we built up a data science team, we built out a branding team, a PR team, all the things as we hit different levels of organization.
Sure.
But remember, I went from a business that was doing $2 million a month when we started to $30 million when I left.
Wow.
And you go through several different transformations
Sure.
over those 4 or 5 years that we were there.
Absolutely. And one thing you mentioned that was interesting, being a first marketer there, and I remember when we first started working with The Honest Company, who we in this very thought leadership series met with about 2 months ago. We engaged them when there were only 2 marketers, and now they have over 20 people on their marketing team. What were some of your first hires?
And knowing who those 2 marketers were, they were not my first 2, actually.
Okay.
No. So I remember the first person we hired was, I think, an email manager.
Okay. Yeah.
Literally someone
Very
to
typical.
make sure that the emails were getting delivered, that we had visibility into bulking across, email, Yahoo, at that point, Hotmail, even
Sure.
people had AOL accounts
Right.
back then.
AOL, what is that?
Yeah, exactly. Second, we actually hired a marketing communications person.
Okay.
And that was a lot, again, because of our perspective. We were, at that time, it was companies like Rulala and Gilt and HauteLook, and we were the third.
Yep.
And we would never, before I started, HauteLook was never mentioned. Our goal was to get mentioned alongside Gilt.
Sure.
To say, not dissimilar to like Dropbox now and Box. Like you see these, you want to be in the A group.
Right.
And so we spent time and money trying to get us into the A group. And so the first 2 people who were around, I remember it was Haley Osher, who I had worked with, and she'd hit me if I called her an email manager, but she was really focused on the email side of the lifecycle management side.
Sure.
And Carrie Bennett, who is now the CMO at Dog Vacay here in
Right.
Los Angeles, was focused on the branding and communication side. So
Got
those
it.
were, again, and those also candidly complement skills that I didn't necessarily have.
Got it.
And then we brought in the customer acquisition, which I think is the person you were actually talking about at Honest, to start figuring out the levers to drive the customer acquisition side of the business.
Got it. And did you feel that it changes and as the marketing scales? Because obviously when you guys are doing 30 million per month, like the marketing team, probably the composition of the team kind of shifts from different focus. And so at towards the end, what would you say in terms of percentage? 30% on branding, 70% on.
Oh, it was like the team as a whole.
Breakdown. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say, actually, it was actually not so much. It was more and more towards acquisition because it was harder and harder.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. So as you scale,
Absolutely.
you run out, and I did some work yesterday thinking about this conversation as the evolution of where customers came from for HauteLook over a 4-year period of time, and the shift from it being primarily referral and organic driven to primarily paid driven.
Right.
Is an evolution, I think. Candidly, we underinvested in, we'll talk about it later, I'm sure. We underinvested in retention programs earlier. And a lot of that, candidly, was my thought that the business itself was so compelling, i.e. you get great brands, great products at 50% off.
Right.
What do I need to do? Why do I need to give more stuff
Right.
to my customers? I'm already giving them a great value proposition.
Right.
Versus building what we should have done is build the plumbing to build very robust retention capabilities earlier on, and would have got greater payback down the line.
Sure.
So I think it's, I want to say every day you felt like you were just trying to keep your head above water.
Right.
Because as the market got more complex, got more expensive, people started copying your tactics. It's hard to stay and keep your advantage.
Right.
So you're always fighting to do that on a daily basis.
Yep. So earlier you talked about wanting to be named, really put side by side with Guild Group, and then looking at sort of the competitors and how
at that time, right?
Yeah, and how the landscape changes. So as a CMO, how much attention do you pay to competition, and how much do you ask your team? Because I'm thinking about our audience right now. A lot of them, for example, we're working with a brand called Soma Water. They're just getting started. They have a smaller marketing team, great brand, but they haven't really invested much elsewhere. So for our audience, what would you recommend as a CMO or as the head of marketing? How much should you actually pay attention to competition, or it really is about knowing exactly who you're selling to and then being able to kind of use your intuition and data to sort of come up with the best marketing strategy?
Yeah. The reality is that the right answer is not very much, but the true answer is way more than you should.
Right.
I mean, you live vicariously through your own experiences, your own customer data, and what your competitors are doing, because you always think they know something that you don't know.
Yep.
Back then, again, this is 5 years ago, it was literally like Google alerts, right? And if you saw something, now there's all sorts of tracking capabilities. There's companies like Atomic or TrackMaven or others where I could literally recreate what my competitor's advertising program is in real time, maybe even before they do. Then especially you would get hung up on like business development partnerships.
Right.
If Gilt or someone announced a deal with Virgin America, you're like, I didn't even think about that idea. How far away are we? Or a great PR story, or candidly, the product they would sell, like a great brand that a competitor would have that we wouldn't. So I think, but I do think it's the job of the leadership of the organization to take the brunt of that and let the team excel at what they do. You don't want all your team being forwarding emails and sending you links of, oh, look what this company's doing. That's not their job. Their job is to execute.
Right.
Your job is to worry.
Right.
And because mostly that worry comes from your board and your CEO and your investors.
Right.
And you don't want, I think the job of CMO is as much about just shielding your team from all the stuff and the crap that goes on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So, no, look, the reality is you can't let your competitors point you in the strategic direction, but they're not idiots either. I think a lot of, and now he's in as an investor now, with my companies and other companies, I think people assume that the other guys don't know what they're doing.
Right.
Because you're so into what you're doing and you're such a believer in your own business that your way is the right way.
Right.
The reality is you may be right, you may be wrong, but never discredit a competitor.
Right.
They're as smart as we are, their investors are as smart, or their shareholders are smart, or the businesses they're in may be better. And you need to have a point of view, but you need to be very cognizant of those threats are real, and they might know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important as well. So it's a fine balance, and I don't know if anyone ever gets it right.
Sure. No, but that's really good sound advice that are fairly practical. And I would say, before we go into some of the more tactical and in terms of acquisition channels and the details, is I think a lot of guys on the call are really looking forward to learning some tangible takeaways from you as well. What are one thing you mentioned is early on you were looking at building a brand, and also there's obviously, in terms of customer acquisition, there's a constant battle between branding and performance marketing.
Yep.
So how did you strike a balance at the beginning, or pretty much you knew that you had a certain goals that, within the first year, and then so you kind of ignore one side versus the other, and how has that evolved as the business grows?
Right. Well, I think branding, it's a constant battle, but I think it isn't also totally siloed.
Right.
So the marketing, a true marketer, I believe, has much more influence than just acquiring customers and retaining them. I think it has to do with things like using HauteLook as an example.
Right.
We had literally 3 different names. My first month at HauteLook, after trying to get the email in the inbox, was figuring out what to call the company, because it was supposed to be originally HauteLook, like was very French.
Okay.
But all our customers said HauteLook, which was kind of a little porny. Like we owned HauteLook.com, but you would think that wasn't necessarily meant to be like a fashion e-commerce business. We settled in the middle because there was actually candidly a brand in Los Angeles called Haute Hippie, and they had said, and so we said, hey, it works for them, it'll work for us.
Right.
So we never had but literally everyone in the company said it differently.
Right.
So first thing we had to figure out is make sure all 100 people who worked for HauteLook said the word HauteLook.
Right.
Right. It was little things like, and I'll make fun of Jerry, is the L in HauteLook is capitalized.
Right.
The CEO of the company had a lowercase L. We had to make sure that the whole company had, so the little email signature had to be uniform.
Right.
Like, so brand consistency, if you can't agree on what your brand stands internally, what your brand stands to your partners, then what your brand stands to customers, none of it even matters. So a lot of it was setting the tone and doing style guides and just getting people around the table to understand that brand was important.
Right.
Then it was about things like, if you look back at the early HauteLook days of, we were a West Coast casual chic business. And so we did things like create directives where all of the pictures that you would take with models were all pointing west.
Okay.
Right? So not necessarily into the ocean, because you didn't want girls in swimsuits with palm trees, but it was things like you would see sunsets versus sunrises, right? You would see pictures of the vineyards of Santa Barbara, which is incredibly beautiful, where you could literally see grapes, fog, and then water. But it was this idea of West Coast, and what are all the things that we could do from a branding and an imaging perspective to make us a West Coast casual chic brand. Right. And so the little things, I think, from a marketing perspective add up. And there are great brands who do that today. Like Warby Parker is a great example.
Right.
I would say, Red Bull does a great job with this. Nike does a great job. Like, these are brands that are new and old, but just how important they truly are.
Right.
You just have to get that right. And then, so I don't think any of that cost any money. It was opportunity to cost. I don't think we ever spent a penny on brand advertising. I think if we did branding, it was probably more supplier or partner driven.
Right.
Like, how do you get the forever 7 for all mankind to know about HauteLook, versus trying to build a brand. I think the brand is more action driven than paid driven. The spend that we did was much more customer acquisition focused. However, we got in constant battles with the customer acquisition team that would say, hey, a picture of men's underwear will convert more clicks than a picture of a pair of denim jeans. Even though the conversion might have been higher, we would have to step on the toes of the customer acquisition team to say, that's not what the brand is supposed to communicate.
Got it. So marketers take notes, men's underwear sell really well.
Yeah, well, pictures of men's underwear and early Facebook ads were incredibly high click-through rates.
All right.
Now, that doesn't drive to conversion, but I think now display isn't as cool as it was 5 years ago.
Right.
But you see a lot of, what are the ads where you bang you like slap the monkey? What's that? What the game? You see, whatever. This is before mobile games. We're so old now. No, but this idea being that just because something drives a click doesn't mean it drives conversion.
Right.
And until you build the mechanism to understand the value of each customer, you can't actually declare. And no one gets paid in traffic. It's all about the conversion. So finding that right balance. And over time, even as we eventually 4 years later made our way into television, it was branded TV, but with a direct response measurement. Right. And you get the halo effect of the brand, but it was never meant just to build the brand itself.
So you touch on, and the fact that you're an analytics guy, how during the early days when there's really not much campaigns that you can look after and look at the performance, and when you hire your first acquisition guy, a lot of campaigns that you run, would you say a lot of it's still a little bit based on intuition, and once you kind of get momentum and kind of have some ideas like what performs well, then you start to become more sophisticated? Yeah,
it was really about identifying what are the 3 or 4 key KPIs early on. And in our business it was, and we had drilled it down to specifically one data point, which said, if a new sign up came back to the site within 72 hours, they had a 10x likelihood of being a better customer. And so that was a key metric for us, was getting person to come back a second time.
Right.
Facebook's analogy was once you uploaded a photo,
Right.
like that was, you knew that they were hooked or they were a customer. I think every business has that second action that actually is a great predictor. I don't know how accurately predicted, but I could tell you at magnitude it was important action.
Sure.
So instead of trying to get people into the buy funnel, for example, and the HauteLook example, there would be days or weeks where we may not have had anything that you wanted to buy. But if I could get you to come back and check and see what we had on the shelves that day, that was an important action. So it was more about the intuition about what campaigns could we run, what actions could we drive that got people to be engaged in the site and then to move forward from there.
And how important, and I know that 5 years ago, mobile might not be as prominent as today, but did you guys look into, and obviously HauteLook has a mobile app, and it's actually got a great app, and I'm a user, but how much attention do you guys pay to mobile?
We paid a lot. We were right about that. I think we made a couple, I think it was 2010,
right?
That we were the first of the second wave of apps. So this is around iPhone 2, maybe iPhone 3. I don't remember which one it says. 2010.
You got
I remember,
too much gray hair to remember that.
We spent $250,000. I'll remember, and it was like fighting to get that spend with the board. We didn't have the internal capabilities, but we had an incredibly strong engineering team that early on built APIs that enable us to build the app.
Sure.
Second, we only focused on Apple. We had some early data insights that said that no one was buying anything with Androids, and that's still the case.
Right.
But we didn't waste cycles on doing all the other apps for all the other. We only did an iPhone app.
Okay.
And then secondarily, we made it relatively simple, meaning we didn't try and recreate the business. We felt that by getting the ability for women to interact with HauteLook for 5 minutes every day, that we didn't have to try and do too much on mobile. And I remember, I bet now mobile on HauteLook is 60 to 70% of the business. I remember the first year we projected it would be 5%, and it was like over 10, and the board thought we were crazy. So there's no doubt that we were part of a generation of companies that benefited from mobile, and I think flash sales in particular work really great on mobile. And so, again, that was as much a bet, but it's also came from insights of our customers. And we knew, we did a lot of ethnography work. We really had a good understanding. We called her Jessica. We had built a profile around her. We knew what kind of car she drove, and these are all stereotypes of. We knew that she lived in Los Angeles and drove a BMW 330 and worked at an ad agency and was 31 with a boyfriend, probably lived in Santa Monica. And so we knew that she had an iPhone. Right. And we knew that she was busy and that she engaged with us for a very few minutes a day. And so let's build the right experience for her. And that we take that, it sounds so simple, but you just try not to do too much. Right. And you build the programs to try and find Jessica over and over again.
Got it. So to summarize that, because I think this is definitely an interesting topic for a lot of people. So on mobile, definitely key focus is to stay start with Apple, start with the iOS.
If it's e-commerce related.
If it's e-commerce, right? And then stay focused and the underlying is actually know your audience, right? And then figuring out how to target them and what is it they're looking for, brand it the right way, keep it simple, and then focus on engagement.
Yeah, that's right. And so mobile messaging is a huge, and as you know, I push you here, is a huge opportunity for marketers. Right. It's the email that you can't unsubscribe from. Right. Right. And
but what if they turn off their mobile push notification capability?
You have to give them a reason to keep it on. Right. Right. And so whether you use, naturally you're going to go however, I would argue your best customers, which is where actually if you're mobile only, it's different. Right. If you're, to me, mobile for a business like HauteLook or a brand like Nordstrom or something like that is part of the loyalty program itself. Right. Is that your best customers are the one using it, right? Not your newest customers. And if your best customers are using it, they won't even think about turning off the messaging. Right. Just like they wouldn't think about unsubscribing from your emails. Yep. Right. And so again, you just have to look at if your focus is on customer acquisition, then you have to create a really damn compelling reason not to turn off notifications.
Absolutely.
If it's your best customer, it's not even in the consideration set, so don't worry about it.
Right.
Just don't abuse the privilege, just like you wouldn't send 10 emails in a single day.
Right.
And now you have the ability to personalize mobile messaging. You can send messaging at different times, just make sure you do it right. It's no different.
Right. So since we're talking about sort of the knowing our best customers, and earlier you mentioned the concept of sort of customer lifetime value, let's talk a little bit around during your days as a CMO at HauteLook, how intimately were you guys aware of sort of your customer lifetime value for mobile user, for customers that came through Facebook versus other paid channels?
Yep. So we had literally built very early on a pretty robust cohort calculator, for lack of a better term.
And for those that don't know the concept of cohort, can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's like it's putting an ID tag on every single new customer who comes in.
Right.
And on that ID tag is the date by which that you acquired them, and the method by which you acquired them.
Yep.
So let's assume that I did a Facebook ad with the keyword targeting the keyword sample sale.
Right.
In January of 2013,
Right.
and Jerry Zhao signed up that day, you are stamped with several variables. So I can then say, show me all the Jerry Zhaos that I acquired in January and what they're doing over time. Show me all the people that acquired via Facebook over a period of time. All the ones were tied to the keyword sample sale. So you just have several different variables by which to measure the value of a customer. And then you watch their activity from the beginning all the way through until the end. Even if they unsubscribe, doesn't matter. You keep tracking them because 10% of business probably comes from people who unsubscribe to your emails.
Right.
And so that's the idea. If you keep that record, you can then understand over time the predictability of revenue. So we could say, of all the people that we acquired in January 2013, I could tell you what their sales would be in January 15 with predictability, because I have built all the capabilities to measure long-term transactional value.
That's a good
and
point.
so you can kind of, if you don't have predictability of revenues, it's very difficult to do budgeting, to do forecasting, to do inventory planning.
Right.
So you have to be able to do bottoms up. So I think it's important not just to know what people have done in the past, but you use data and predictive data capabilities to project what's going to happen in the future. And then if you can optimize that, a little bit of a push towards where the shift from acquisition to retention, you can then potentially lower acquisition costs, increase retention value, and that will drive profitability. I think right now we tend to be in a market where, especially if you're a startup, where you're getting bonused and enhanced on customer acquisition. That will change. Eventually we will realize that sometimes it's better to reinvest in current consumers than new consumers, and especially as it gets harder and harder to acquire customers over time. But I do think being able to keep score, not just of where your business was yesterday, but what it will do tomorrow. I think because in marketing and a business, you never want to be surprised, right? If you don't have predictability in your business, and you see this as some publicly traded companies that will say they're going to have revenues of X and they do revenues of Y, and the markets will punish them. You have to have predictability because it drives the rest of the business. How many people do you have in customer service? How much inventory should your brand buyers have? How much money should be allocated on spend? How many people you can hire, what your bonuses can be. They're all tied to what you're going to do on a future basis. The only way to get that is to understand what your customers are going to spend.
And earlier, and those are great points, and in terms of just having predictability around your business, because obviously you have to manage up as a CMO. But one thing that I'm really curious around the concept of cohort calculator. So beyond the payment system, the methods in which they were acquired, the keywords in which they were acquired with, and literally you guys would have a number, a dollar sign next to that customer. So whether it's Jessica that worked at an ad agency in the example you gave versus Jerry from San Francisco, and so there will be a different value next attached to each customer. Wow.
Yeah, no, we would actually go a step further and try and, this took time, right?
Sure.
So let's say we figured out that the average buyer.
How long did that take you guys to get that cohort calculator down?
Well, it just evolved. We had it at the beginning, but it was way better after 4 years than the first year.
Of course.
But to give an example, is we knew that the average customer would buy 4 times and spend, I won't get specific, let's say spend $400, $400 a year, just making up a number. and that year 1 would be X and year 2 would be Y, and we could then know that there was a drop-off after year 2, and we could figure out value. And then, it's important about how you calculate lifetime value as well. It's really not lifetime.
Right.
It's much shorter than that. And so what's your margin on it?
Right.
How much did you spend? And and things like that, which probably don't have time to get into. But there's a lot of data and research out there to suggest that knowing candidly what your payback times are on customer acquisition is incredibly important.
Yep.
And then the other part, which is that we would get to the point where I should be able to tell 80% about you by just looking at your email address and where you came from. So if I know, for example, that you have a Gmail address instead of a Yahoo email address, I know you're likely to be a 50% better customer. If I know you have an iPhone instead of an Android, I know you're 50%. If I know that you live in Los Angeles instead of Boise, with all due respect to Boise, you're going to be a better customer. And so if I can find a woman in Los Angeles with a Gmail and an iPhone, I know that she's 5 times better than someone else. All right. And so by getting and understanding that data, and there are third parties, you can learn that yourself. You then start really beginning to understand where to apply your resources over time.
Right.
And that's important, I think, from a retention perspective in particular, is once I've acquired a customer, how do I know who to spend my time and money against?
Right.
If I did the same program for everybody versus getting the right message or the right offer to the right customer at the right time, I get exponential returns, and that's what we spent a lot of time doing. I think we were very early. We worked very early with a company called Data Logics that was recently acquired by Oracle. We were the first customer, and I think we were 2 to 3 years ahead of everyone else. If I look back, there were 3 or 4 things I did. That was one of them, which I still think today is cutting edge, and it was having a robust data mart, building the predictability to figure out exactly. And that's, candidly how we got to know you, is this idea of this should be a tool that everyone should have access to, even if you don't have 30 data scientists sitting in a room.
So obviously you invested in that early, and because you're an analytics guy and you're passionate about sort of the concept of the life cycle and the lifetime value of a customer, but what would you recommend to a lot of businesses that maybe they don't have the resources early on, or they're not part of a bigger company that have the financial resources? Like, at what point do you think it's good for a company to start thinking about customer retention versus early on? A lot of it, like you said, it's about branding, it's about customer acquisition.
Well, I think if you're not thinking about it over time, because it's at the beginning you're making, because it's not that hard. So just understanding where your best customers came from. That should be driving where you're moving to acquire. Like you don't go fishing in a pond that has no fish. Right. And if you know what you're measuring, and you don't get compensated for how many times you cast a line. It's how many times that line, the bait gets bitten, right? I think marketing's the same way. So if you don't understand what happens to your customers after you acquire them, you have no right being in the business of acquiring customers at all. So I guess I kind of chuckle because I can't imagine there being, and I know that's not the case, but you have to understand that because you just get more efficient. Because I think we live in a world, and I learned this at eBay in particular, a world, even a business the size of eBay, a $75 billion market cap business in 2003 and 2004, you have constrained resources. You have to make calls on what you do and what you don't do. And so you want to make your calls on the things you know are going to work the best. Right? And so the only reason you know that is you have the data to support that. Even if it's as basic as saying, I only want to acquire customers who live in California because people who live in California are twice the customers than those who don't. That's okay. That's an insight that I wouldn't scale with that, but it's better than nothing at all. Right? And I think everyone with an Excel spreadsheet should get some idea. As well as if you're closer to business, you just have intuition. Right? Not everything has to be qualitative. There can be quantitative. Research panels. There are now cool things like SurveyMonkey, which we didn't even have back in 2009, to understand exactly what some commonalities between your customers are. But you have to be thinking about. You may not be thinking about robust loyalty programs and incentive programs and offers, but at least having the data set to make basic assumptions about the business, I think, is incredibly core to what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And what let's talk about budget a little bit, because I think for marketers, one of the biggest concern is always around ROI. And then so when you took the job with HauteLook your first week, how did you figure out what's the right budget for you? And did you just kind of magically, there's a number that fell on your desk and from your CEO and say, hey, Greg, here's $500,000, and once you grow the business to $5 million a month, and now that budget goes to $1 million?
Like every other marketer, I was told what my budget was.
All right.
Right? And so I've never met a marketer who got to choose their own budget.
Okay.
And so ours was tied to a percent of revenue, right? And so I think at that point we were 10% of revenue.
Okay.
And it worked its way down to 7 over time, but it was
so
like,
as the scale.
so you had $100,000, then $200,000, then $500,000, then $1 million, then $3 million, right? And so it was always tied to that. And then from there, I think it's important when you think about how much money do I spend on, say, acquisition versus retention. It's a broader equation. So I could make the argument, use a company like Zappos, which doesn't have a loyalty program, but their whole business is loyalty driven. Meaning they take their gross margin and they lower it in exchange for creating a great customer experience. So the time when you buy 6 pairs of shoes and send back 5 and think, ha ha ha, I got them. They're like, yeah, you did. That's the whole idea. And you come back and you buy and you buy. So instead of being a high gross margin product, Nordstrom is the same way. They have far more staff at a Nordstrom than a Macy's. Right? They have a far more liberal return policy than most. And that is their loyalty program. It may not be out of the marketing budget, but it's something the company has decided to do. So when you think about, I would make the argument that you have to figure out what your value proposition is. If you're selling a commoditized product, like a Walmart, for example, it's all about low price. And the loyalty, what keeps traffic coming is the lowest price. You don't have to have a loyalty program. Versus a business like Gap or something, which is somewhat commodity product, but it's a vertical. They have some gross margin to play with. They can offer incentive structure to be able to do that. The casinos are great examples where whether you decide to go left or right into Harrah's property or into a MGM property, the incentives they give you are incredibly important around that. So I think it all has to do with a lot of just what your margin structure and profitability targets are, as well as culturally at the company, what are you investing in and what you're not investing in.
Those are great points, and I love the Nordstrom and Zappos example because a lot of times us as marketers we're thinking about the money that we get, but actually comes to customer retention, it can come from a lot of other channels.
Absolutely, and I think marketing-driven organizations like those think about the overall equation, not just the 7% of spend that marketers have. And if you are put in one of those buckets, you're in a tough spot. You have to start convincing the rest of the organization about what how to invest that.
And that's a great point. And I remember last week I was at the Adobe Summit and I was talking to a couple analysts from Gartner.
Are you name dropping?
Well, part of the game, right? So we were talking about big data, millennial marketer, and just the fact that in today's world there's so much more data available. And you saw this 5 years ago, and you started investing Datamart and just getting different types of data to help you understand your business. But how much of it, in your personal opinion, there really is a big data trend, and or is this something that people just kind of came up with and think that's cool?
No, I think I would say there's more data, and there's smarter ways by which you can access that data. I think if you're a very young company, you should not be spending too much time thinking about big data. If you're Walmart or Amazon, where every basis point drives huge change in your business, big data is incredibly important. So it all depends on where you are. If it's about thinking about how do I use data to drive a 10% increase in conversion on my website, that's a huge thing, right? Which is very different than trying to drive 10 basis points of improvement on something else. And so I think you can get absorbed by too much data, and I think candidly, if you're not fully equipped or licensed, I would use the term, to drive the data, you probably shouldn't be. You should rely on third-party tools or professionals to figure out exactly what to get. But you can be paralyzed by the data, analysis paralysis, the term. You need to be careful with that. So it's about using the big data sets in smart ways. And I think now, whether it's on-site conversion tools like an Optimizely, whether it's retention tools like Retention Science and everything in between, I think now there are a great suite of products that exist to do lots of great things. You can't just plug them in. I think you have to have some foundation. Whether it's you work with a great email solutions provider or a great e-commerce platform, like a Demandware or ExactTarget, like you can then plug in additional tools that candidly those core platforms don't provide. They might tell you they provide them, but the reality is, they help you send an email or take an order, but they can't do much more than that.
Right.
That's where the optimize leads and retention sciences on both ends may come in.
Right. And do you feel that the concept of millennial marketers versus, you grew up in eBay.
I'm a Gen Xer.
You're a Gen Xer, right? So there's been a lot of discussions and talks on, over different publications about millennial marketers think differently. And because now we're targeting a different crowd, and have you seen, like when you looked at some of your first hire, you mentioned Haley and Carrie, and how do you see them different from the millennial marketers and in today's world? And because marketing is about understanding how your end audience perceive the brands and.
Well, I guess I should just say it's all hogwash. That Twitter will like that and other things. But the reality is you evolve as a marketer. And marketers have to be forward thinking, right? And so the only difference between a millennial and a Gen Xer is Gen Xer just older. Like when I grew up and in high school, we didn't have the internet. If I would have had the internet or a phone that I could do anything with, I would be a millennial, but I'm not. I'm 42 and you just change. And it hasn't been revolutionary, it's been evolutionary. And so the consumer has been changing for a long time. Now, obviously, the marketers themselves, i.e. the firms who get paid to start spewing statistics, are calling a whole new different class of people. The reality is we're not that different. The trait of in commerce in particular is you have to have something compelling, create something compelling, and people might be interested in consuming it. Now the way we talk about it and tell that story is very different. And so brands have been built over, we talked about Nordstrom, like Nordstrom versus Warby Parker. Like Nordstrom's brand was built at a time that we didn't necessarily have the same tools. People who love Nordstrom in the same way that people who love Under Armour love Under Armour. The brands were built in different times, but they're really the same. It's just you did different tactics to do it. And maybe Nordstrom has to change now. And even Under Armour has to change now versus we'll insert millennial brand here. But it's important. I think what's different now is the tactics by which you tell the stories. So I think I tell Jerry this all the time, I think I'm very rusty now. If I were to redo it, the whole influencer marketing now didn't exist 2 years ago. 4 years ago, Facebook didn't exist from a channel. And in 2 years, we're going to be talking about something that doesn't exist now. Marketers just have to be on top of things and understand. If you keep score, you can understand that $1 spent on influencer marketing is better than $1 spent on display marketing. But the reality is it all comes back to the same place. If you turn on Bravo right now, I guarantee you're seeing an e-commerce company being advertised to you. If you look at my mail that I get every day, I think I tweeted something out. It was like a Bonobos catalog. Every catalog I got was from an e-commerce only business.
And they're opening
and they're opening stores. At the end of the day, it's all the same. You run out of tactics and you want to tell stories to your customers in different ways. I think now, things like influencer marketing and partnership marketing and really separating yourself from the noise is important because consumers, and this is back to millennials, want an authentic voice versus a purely transactional value voice. And I think you're seeing a shift in the market around it being like the difference between a Walmart and a Costco or things like that, where it's not just about value. It is about more now, and that's how you differentiate in the market.
So we're about 2/3 in the way of the program, and we'll open up for Q&A shortly. And what we talked about today was really your journey as a CMO, how you got started, how you formed your team with a budget that kind of just dropped on your desk, and your mobile strategy, your acquisition strategy, how you looked at data, having, most importantly, predictability into your business so you can manage up as well as manage down. So. To wrap up all this great learning, Greg, you started talking a little bit about sort of the recent trends, but I'm curious, and for everybody that's on the call, if you were to start HauteLook today, what would you do differently?
From a marketing perspective?
As a CMO, as a first marketer.
I think I would. It's a great question, and I tried to tie in a couple of the responses to there. I definitely wouldn't advertise on television as early as we did. And to give some context, we were already doing almost $10 million a month before we started advertising on television. And so I think people jump too fast into mass market before the brand is really where it needs to be. I would focus a lot more early on understanding exactly what was driving the customers. Why was Jerry Zhao coming to HauteLook, especially when I didn't ever talk to him before?
Right.
Was it word of mouth driven? I would spend more time understanding the pathway, or think of when we were in school, how a bill becomes a law.
Right.
Really understand how different classes of customers and have visibility into that pathway. I would spend more time thinking about how to drive more value, how to squeeze the rock a little bit more early on versus how to get another one in.
Okay.
It's really easy to spend money and get a customer, but I think you sell yourself short in figuring out how to maximize that value.
Right.
If you look at, and now as an investor, I look for companies that can create larger shares of wallet over time. It's truly a unicorn that doesn't happen very often.
Right.
Amazon may be one of the few companies where every year you spend a little bit more money than you did the year before. Very few businesses are like that. I think those companies that invest in understanding their customer, and Amazon realized that it was about fast and free, right? And so they changed their business model or modified their business model to focus on that part and figured out how, if I can create this thing called Amazon Prime, people think they're getting free shipping, but they're really not.
Right.
Right. I'm charging them, what do they charge them now? $70 a year, $60 a year. But you don't know. Costco is a great example of this. You forget that you spend $50 a year to be part of a club.
Right.
So then you get your 85 gallons of Diet Coke for 10 cents cheaper. Yeah. Right? And it's figuring out exactly the emotional side of the customer, which is important. I think I would have embraced and really invested in that. Now the reality is if you're in a hyper growth business, we talked about competitors early on, you probably don't get the chance to react that fast. Right. Or you're forced to react faster. I wish I would have spent the time, because you just need to slow it down a little bit. Sure. You need to, you want to take risks, but you don't want to take huge risks. And you wanted to make sure. The second thing I would have done differently is I probably would have invested more in trying new things faster. You tend to find some things that work, and then you double down, triple down on them, and things might pass you by, and then you always want to be having 10 to 20% of your time and spend just trying stuff out, because you never know. And I think I look back, we talked about things like, we discovered YouTube before anyone else. Right. So now there's huge business where you spend $100,000 to get someone to put your product in one of their videos. It used to cost $1,000. Right. And when you were the first ones, you literally get millions of page views, millions of video views for nothing, because no one else had figured it out. I want to find those next things down the road. I'll use Zappos again. When you go to the airport now and you put your shoes in the thing, in the scanner, and there's that Zappos ad, that was incredibly brilliant, and I bet they didn't pay anything for it, because who would have thought about buying the bottom of a plastic bin at an airport? How do you separate yourself from the clutter? I would have invested more time in trying to be creative about marketing opportunities or cross-marketing opportunities like that.
I would say they probably pay for those signs that on your way driving to Vegas, those Zappos signs, they probably pay for.
Yeah, they paid, but what it would have cost now. Right. So the first person to advertise or be part of Virgin America's versus the 10th, probably 10x more. Right. Like, how do you get the value by arbitraging as marketers? And I think, on the customer acquisition side, it's more credit. I think on the retention side, it's even, nobody does a very good job or a great job. But I think but we will all start spending a lot more time, because it's more and more competitive on the customer acquisition side. Sure.
And then just to wrap up before we open up for Q&A, and for those who are on the call, you can start entering questions for Greg in your GoToWebinar, or tweet at RetentionSci, RetentionSci, and then we'll get those questions and we'll present that to Greg. But last question from us, and what lessons do you have for marketers, and something that come from you, like your biggest lesson, biggest takeaway?
Oh, I'm not even going to be able to answer that. I would say somewhat similar to what I said last time, is the game is constantly changing, and you can't be naive to think that what worked yesterday is going to work tomorrow. Okay. And I think as marketers, we have to constantly thinking about what's next and not take anything for granted. That could be, I look at HauteLook examples. We had to completely change the dynamics of our team, moving from an online customer acquisition entity to a full online, offline acquisition and retention team. Right. And so when you're thinking about hiring, does this person maybe solves a current need, but does she project out to do something else? Right. And you'd rather have someone who projects out to do more than someone who solves a near-term need.
Right.
Because we're all commoditized, we're all replaceable, even if you're the CMO. And I think just figuring out I think that's a big insight is think about a team when it's not, the idea when you're where you are now in a business, that in a year or 2 years you could be doing 10 times the business.
Yep.
It happens. Are you prepared for it?
Right.
Because you don't have a lot of lead time. So thinking about the team, I think that would have been, and it turned out we did a very good job of hiring great teams and brought in great people. But that would be something I think is a lesson. The second is, you really have to be worried that tomorrow might be different, and I think that's important. And so you're always scouring for opportunities, and you're never denying the chance to meet someone smart who has an innovative idea that could help your business in an interesting way.
So stay humble, stay scrappy. Things are changing.
Yes, that's right.
That's great.